My name is Max Herman. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at New Jersey City University in Jersey City. I have been studying the topic of urban riots or civil disorders or rebellions for about 20 years now. I did my master's degree at Yale University and my PhD at University of Arizona. I wrote my dissertation on 4 riots in 20th century America on Chicago, Detroit, Miami, and Los Angeles. And then I came here to Newark in 2000 to work at Rutgers University. I would say the plans for the 40th commemoration, or the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of 1967, really started back in 2001. And they started with the former director of the Historical Society, a lady by the name of Sally Yurkovich. She had decided at that point, or had started to explore the possibility of doing something big and doing something bold to commemorate the events of 1967. And initially this was going to be a collaborative project with other museums. We were in discussions with the African American Museum in California, in Oakland, California. We were also in discussions with the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit and the Washington, D.C. Historical Society. And in fact, we had a meeting with representatives from all of those organizations, and we were talking about how we would go about doing a coordinated program on not just on Newark, but on those cities as well. And there were some challenges there, both administratively and ideologically. It was difficult initially to even settle on a name of what to call this thing. And again, the language issues came up. Do you call it rebellion? Do you call it riot? Do you call it civil disorders? The people from Detroit were very adamant about calling it a rebellion, and they were African American Museum. Some folks from the Historical Society, myself included, were looking for a somewhat more neutral term. We didn't want riot, we didn't want rebellion. We wanted something that would allow enough room for people to come to their own conclusions about the events. And that was tough. We didn't want to alienate anybody. And if you come in with an angle by calling it a rebellion, there you go, you lose half of your audience. You call it a riot, you lose the other half of your audience. So we were trying to create something that would be relatively non-judgmental. We didn't want it to be simple. We didn't want it to be black and white. These people good, those people bad. This is right, this is wrong. We wanted people to take some time to reflect on the events and to see it from multiple perspectives, and to really wrestle with the issues involved so that it would become more complicated. If anything, we were sort of hoping that people would come here and maybe they'd even be a little bit confused. They would come in with an initial notion, yeah, the riots. And they would leave thinking, well, I don't know, was that really a riot? Maybe the people there was a point to it all. And we wanted some of the people who came in thinking it's a rebellion to go home saying, well, you know, maybe those National Guards people, they weren't as evil as we made them out to be. Maybe they were young and scared and you know, and maybe other people suffered as well. I'll have to say, I think my favorite moment was when the exhibit opened in 2007. And Amiri Baraka, the famous poet-playwright, who's very much part of the African American community, was standing in conversation with Paul Zygo, who's a former National Guardsman. And that could not have happened 45 years ago. That never would have happened in 1967. And the fact that these two guys were standing face to face and talking to each other in dialogue in a polite, respectful manner, that really blew my mind. And that, I thought, was a major accomplishment. If we could get people to do that, to move beyond their assumptions and presuppositions about what happened and why it happened, and actually talk to each other, then I think we accomplished a great deal. I also have to give a tremendous amount of credit to Linda Caldwell Epps, who, after Sally Yurkovich moved on, Sally basically came up with the idea, but Linda was the person that really implemented the idea. She was the driving force in making this happen. Linda was the person that convened what we then referred to as the Big Bad Committee that was coordinating a series of programs around the 40th anniversary. But it took a lot of courage for her in her role as president and CEO of the New Jersey Historical Society to push for this exhibit. And again, we struggled with the language, but one day Linda and I were sitting around in her office, and all of a sudden she came up with the title, What's Going On? And we were both sort of listening to a lot of music, and we were listening to Marvin Gaye, and all of a sudden just clicked, and she said, that's it, we're going to call this What's Going On, Newark and the Legacy of the 60s. And it was perfect, because in many of my oral history interviews that I had conducted over the 6-7 years in Newark, people would say that phrase. They would be out on the street, and stuff would happen, and their first reaction was, what's going on? And so I thought that was a perfect title. But we had the perfect title, but on the other hand, it, as I said, took a lot of courage and it took a lot of effort by Linda Epps to get this thing moving, because frankly, some people didn't want it to happen. Some people were tired of talking about 1967 here. Some people felt that it had given the city a black eye, a bad image, and that we didn't want to dredge up these feelings from the past, better off to kind of bury it. Charles Cummings, who, rest his soul, is the sort of the official historian of Newark and passed away a few years ago, he was one individual that I talked to that really did not want this thing to happen. He loves Newark history, but his feeling was that the riot or the rebellion gets too much emphasis in Newark's history, and people think only of the riot or the rebellion when they think of Newark. And he would prefer that people think about the long history of Newark as a religious and a cultural center, and not always dwell on the riots. And he was not the only one. In fact, there were some members of the board of this institution, of the New Jersey Historical Society, who resigned as a result of the planning for this exhibit. They just thought it was too politically sensitive and something that they didn't see would be of benefit to the Historical Society or even the community in Newark. So there were some people that just did not want to dredge up these memories. But to her credit, Linda felt, and I felt the same way, that these memories were unresolved, that they had to be dredged up, that that we still hadn't faced our history as a city, as people in the city. And if we couldn't do that, we couldn't just, cover it up and paper it over. We really couldn't move forward. And I still feel that way today. I feel that cities, if they don't confront their history, especially those unpleasant moments in their history, they can't move forward. If you think about it, Tulsa, for example, had a riot or rebellion in 1921, one of the worst in American history in terms of loss of life and damage, and really destroyed a very vibrant African American community. And for decades, almost a full century, the city officials in Tulsa tried to cover it up. I've never seen anything to that extent anywhere else, where they actually removed newspapers from that period, from the libraries. They tried to erase any memory of that event. And in Newark, there's a much lesser version about it. It wasn't that people actively tried to remove or obliterate the memory of the event. It was just that people were sort of engaged in passive neglect. That they said, look, we already did something on the 10th anniversary. We did something on the 20th anniversary. We did something on the 30th anniversary. It's about time that we laid this thing to rest. And I disagreed with that, and Linda disagreed with that, and Clement Price at Rutgers disagreed, and Clement was also another driving person in this. Clement was very well connected in Newark, especially Newark politics and the Newark corporate community, and he was able to sort of run some interference for us and say, look, you know, this exhibit is going to be a good thing. This is going to be positive. This isn't going to reinforce the stigma of Newark as this dangerous city that's beset by urban violence. It's going to help Newark heal.
I was wondering if we could maybe speak a little bit about the exhibit itself, especially since you were so instrumental in getting it put together and getting it up and going. And I was wondering if you could describe it for perhaps somebody that did not get an opportunity to see it or visit it. What did it look like? What kind of narrative did it tell? What was included? And maybe what was excluded too, because that's part of the decision-making process. I'm sure there were many things that you wanted to have in the exhibit since you've done so much tremendous research, but maybe some things just didn't make the final cut. So I was wondering if we could speak about that as loudly as you can.
Well, let me start by saying that I'm especially proud that of the 4 institutions that were planning to go ahead with a commemoration of the 40th anniversary, that the New Jersey Historical Society was the only one that actually pulled it off. Unfortunately, the Washington, D.C. Historical Society had some financial problems, as did the Charles Wright Museum. There were political issues that kept it from opening there. And I'm especially proud that we were able to go ahead with it, but it wasn't an easy process. I myself had, by the time I started working with the Historical Society, I had already done about 30 oral history interviews on my own. And then I started working with the Historical Society and coordinating the interviews in 2005. And there were some challenges for me personally, because there were issues of consent forms. I had a very simple consent form. I would interview somebody, I would give them the consent form, it would give me the rights to use their words and their images, and it would allow me to give those rights to anyone whom I chose to do so. When I worked with the Historical Society, there was a bit of a stricter protocol. We would give someone an initial consent form, consent to be interviewed, and then they would have the right to read the transcript of their interview afterwards, and they could approve or disapprove of the transcript. They could suggest changes to the transcript. And frankly, I wasn't terribly comfortable with that. My attitude was, when I do an oral history interview, I sit down with a person, they agree to be interviewed, they say what they say, and then that's it. And so we ran into some problems on that front, because there were certain individuals that were interviewed and they didn't like what they said, or they didn't like how they sounded on tape, and they wanted to amend their remarks. Some people never signed off on their interviews, and that was very frustrating. In fact, one of the officers that arrested John Smith, the incident that actually sparked the riot or rebellion, good interview, afterwards read the transcript. For whatever reason, it was never made clear to me, he decided not to sign off on the interview. And that was very frustrating. And there were also a couple of well-known activists in the African American community here in Newark, and I won't mention their names specifically, but I had interviewed them, and for whatever reason they didn't want their words to be made public. And so they chose not to sign off on having their interview included in the exhibit. And that really angered me. I was like, well, why would you bother to spend the time to sit down and do an interview and then decide that you don't like what you said and you don't want it to be shared publicly? There were some other individuals there was one individual in particular who refused to be interviewed because he was writing his own book, or said he was writing his own book, and that he didn't want anyone else to use his words before he completed his book. And actually, the man had a legitimate point, because many years ago, his work had been basically plagiarized. He was an attorney working with the Newark Legal Services Project back at the time of the riots. He was very young, and he was an activist. And he worked closely with Tom Hayden, who many people know was a leftist activist and was organizing here, community organizer in Newark. After the riot or the rebellion, Tom Hayden took all this information that was put together by people at the Legal Services Project, and he published a book called Rebellion in Newark, and it came out. It was a major publisher, Vintage Press, and if you read that book today, I would say 80% of that work is not Tom Hayden's work, and he never acknowledged the people who did the work, the young attorneys who were out there, who actually took the affidavits of the victims and spent the time putting that information together. And so I understand in some respects where that man is coming from, because you don't want somebody to come in and take your work and not acknowledge it or cite it properly. And I think there's a certain bitterness that kind of lingers. And I think there's also a little bitterness about Tom Hayden, actually, because Tom Hayden was only here for a couple of years. And admittedly, he was walking the streets and knocking on doors and doing community organizing work, but after the rebellion, he was gone. As were most of those young college student activists. They left. And then Tom Hayden went on to fame and fortune in California, married Jane Fonda, and became a state representative. So I understand that, and I think there was a feeling by some activists in this city, African American activists, that those kids were just here for the short term, and they took off. And Tom Hayden especially, because Tom Hayden became such a celebrity. Others actually did stay. There were some of those activists from Newark Community Union Project that did stay in Newark. They kind of went a little more low-key, and I know some of them personally. They helped set up a school for troubled youth in Ironbound. So not all of them left, but many of them did, and there's a certain amount of resentment. But my resentment is that people did interviews, and some of them would not consent for those interviews to be used as part of the exhibit, and that was very frustrating to me, personally. So I started working with Claudia Ocello as well. She was a curator here at the time, and she and I started doing interviews together. In particular, she's a native Italian speaker, so we went up to the North Ward and we put up flyers in English and Italian in all these little cafes and restaurants where the older Italian men would congregate. And it was very interesting that she was able to make contact, and we were able to do some of these interviews jointly with people in the Italian community. And then in the planning stages, as most documentary filmmakers or authors who are doing work of this kind would know, there's hundreds of hours of audio and video. And how do you boil that down into a few panels for an exhibit or into a book? I'm still working on finishing my book on Newark and Detroit in the summer of '67, and I still am struggling with those issues of what to leave in, what to leave out. My chapters are still longer than they should be. They're 40, 45 pages per chapter, and it's hard because the stories to me are so gripping. The other reason I have a tough time making edits is that as a sociologist, I'm very concerned about making sure that the stories are accurate as an oral historian. And I know that's difficult because all oral histories are subjective to a certain degree. People tell the story as they remember it. Sometimes it's shaded by their own interests and their own agendas. On the other hand, I was always looking for confirmatory evidence. If I heard the same story from different people several times, then I would know that I was onto something. And so I was very careful, and I still am in my writing, to make sure that, and maybe it's a little redundant, to make sure that at least 2 people, 3 people, 4 people tell the same story. And then I can be a little bit more confident that in its veracity. For the exhibit, the decisions were a little different. The decisions were sort of made in part by committee. It was myself, there was another lady working here, curator Ellen Snyder-Grenier, and we sat around the table and we thought what kinds of themes should be in the exhibit, what types of people should be in the exhibit, and we wanted to have as many perspectives as possible. The Historical Society also contracted with an outside firm, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's KPM or something like that. And they also worked with us. I sent them the whole box of videotapes and audio tapes and my suggestions. And then they would come back. We put together a spreadsheet. Once we had identified themes, we put together a spreadsheet, and I went back. I spent a year doing that here, going through the interviews and trying to identify snippets of dialogue that would resonate with a particular theme. And in my book, one of the ways that I've been organizing things, organizing chapters, is based on a snippet of dialogue that kind of ties stuff together. So, for example, one of my chapters my first chapter is called Hell Breaks Loose. And I chose that particular phrase because that came straight out of the interviews. People would describe things. This gentleman was waiting for a bus on Washington Street in front of the public library. And he said, there I was waiting for my bus to go home, and all of a sudden hell broke loose. And that phrase came up again and again. So I thought, hell breaks loose. Great idea. Talking with the National Guardsmen and the state police in Detroit and in Newark, they would often use the phrase restoring order. It was our job, it was our mission to restore order. So I pulled that one out as well. But here, the exhibit was organized a little bit more chronologically. We wanted to kind of walk people through the process of how the events unfolded. And we also wanted to make clear that the origins of this urban unrest started a long time before 1967. We wanted to get people out of this notion that, bang, it just happened. And I think people who don't study these events academically think that way. They think, bang, it just happened. Rodney King was acquitted. The officers that beat Rodney King were acquitted in LA, and bang, it just happened. John Smith gets arrested. Bang, it happens. Police raid a nightclub in Detroit. Bang, it happens. But there's something that leads up to it. It builds over time. And we're not just talking about months or even a year. We're talking about years and sometimes decades in which it takes the resentments to build up until eventually the fuse is lit and the situation explodes. So we wanted to start from the beginnings. We wanted to go back to where Newark was at the turn of the century in 1900. We wanted to show that Newark as a city was changing, in part because of industry, in part because of this tremendous influx of African American migrants from the South, which started back in 1910, 1920. There was an article from that time period, I think from around 1920 something, that talked about the danger or possibility of urban unrest or riots in Newark in the 1920s. And it didn't happen back then. But it took 40 years for those frustrations and resentments to build. But we wanted to show also the reasons why people came here to Newark. We wanted to show why African Americans had come up from the South, that they felt that this was a place of opportunity. and how they packed their bags. In the exhibit, you'll see the suitcases and the hat boxes and images of African Americans moving up here. We wanted to show that Newark was at one time an industrial powerhouse where everything was made. Toasters, refrigerators, all kinds of stuff. Leather goods, beer, and there were jobs here. There were good, steady industrial jobs. And we wanted to show how over time Newark began to deteriorate, how those jobs began to disappear, how factories began to close, how the housing situation got progressively worse, that the high-rise public housing projects were built. And even there we wanted to challenge people's assumptions. A lot of people, when they think about the high-rise housing projects like Stella Wright or Scudder Homes, they think, oh God, the projects, they're awful. But they weren't, not when they were built. In fact, one interview I did with a kid who was, he's an adult now, but he was a kid back then. He talked about how they lived outside of the projects, but he had friends who lived in the projects in Stella Wright. And Stella Wright, for him, was paradise. It was brand new, and it was in big apartments with new refrigerators and new ovens and all of that stuff. So this idea that there's something inherently bad or wrong about the projects needed a little bit of correction as well. People talk about the projects as these horrible gang-infested, drug-infested places that needed to be torn down. But back in the 50s when they were first built, people talked about those as well as a place of opportunity. Like, look at this apartment, look at this brand new apartment. So things changed, and we wanted to explore how things had changed over time, how the jobs disappeared, how the projects came to be neglected and began to deteriorate, how entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to build the medical school, to build highways, how people were displaced, how people were angry and frustrated, and then to place the events ultimately in the context of the 1960s and the civil rights movement. So we wanted to move past this kind of simplistic approach that the cab driver gets arrested and beaten by the police, and then all of a sudden the city explodes, and that this is ahistorical and acontextual. So we wanted to put it back into a historical context, and that's really what the exhibit does, is it walks you through that context, through the Great Migration, through the decline of industry, through the civil rights movement, the stirrings of the Black Power movement, and then ultimately gets to the event itself. But we didn't want to start with the event. It's too easy. And it doesn't, if you start with the event, then you lose the ability for reflection. I would not, as I became a more seasoned oral historian, I would not start with talking about the event. Some people would just jump in and they would say, where were you on the night of July 12th, 1967? And I wouldn't do that, because that would already be pushing people into that particular moment. I wanted them to walk into that moment. I would start out by asking, where were you born and raised? Where did you go to high school? What was your neighborhood like? Don't start with the riots or the rebellions, but start with the history behind them. And then you get that sense, that historical progression where people will tell you how things changed. They'll tell you that, my neighborhood was a great place. We used to hang out on our porches. We used to talk with our neighbors. We knew everybody. I think one of the dangers of talking about the event and just focusing on the event is it lets people off the hook in terms of their own part in history. And this is somewhat controversial, but I'm Jewish, and I did a lot of interviews with Jewish merchants in both Newark and Detroit, and people who had moved out to the suburbs in the 40s and 50s. And there's this sort of common mythology that the riots drove the Jewish people out of the city of Newark. Too simple. The Jewish people were already moving out of Newark in the 40s and 50s. They wanted the American dream like everybody else. They wanted a house with a lawn and a 2-car garage, and they wanted better schools, and they wanted to breathe fresh air in places like South Orange and Millburn and Short Hills. And so those who could afford to move, moved. And they moved early on. There was a small segment of the Jewish community that still existed in the Weequahic section by 1967. But even there, things were changing. If you look at the high school yearbooks, the Weequahic high school yearbooks, the faces change. And by 1966, 1967, it's already in racial transition. The Jews are already moving out prior to the riots. But the riot provides a good cover story. The riot, and they call it the riot. The riot lets people off the hook for their decision to move out of the city. So they don't want to acknowledge that they played a role perhaps in moving out to the suburbs, that they took their money with them. They took their businesses with them. But to say the riot drove me out makes it easier psychologically to justify. And I think that's a common theme among white folks, not just Jewish people, but Italians and Irish and others who lived in the city and moved out of the city, is that the riot for them, the riot, is the turning point in the city. Everything was great before the riot. Everybody got along. And then the riot happened, and all of a sudden the city was destroyed. And it's that pivotal point in history that the city, it was day and then it became night. And again, I think that issue, that idea is something that we had to struggle with. We didn't want to let people off the hook in that way, to say before and after. We wanted to show that, Newark was changing gradually, and some of the decisions that people made to relocate to the suburbs or to work in an office building downtown and drive in on the new freeways may have played a role in what actually happened here. So we wanted to shake people up a little bit, and I hope we did. The exhibit could have been a lot simpler. It could have been black and white. It could have focused just on the events itself. It could have said this was a horrible tragedy and left it at that. But instead, it asked some very big questions. And the exhibit ends by asking the big question: is Newark better off today than it was back in the 1960s? And what is the legacy of the 1960s? And again, we didn't want to just jump in and provide a simple answer to that question. We wanted to show how the legacy of the 60s is still present today and how it is complicated. There are some people who moved out of the city never to return. There are people I interviewed in Detroit who live out in the suburbs, and they say that the city of Detroit exists only in my memory. They never go back. And so we were hoping that we would draw people back to the city, and they would understand. Maybe they would come to grips with their own fears and their own memories about the city of Newark, and that hopefully by doing so, the city could start moving forward again.
Do you think we could speak a little bit about the audience, perhaps the intended or anticipated audience for this exhibit, and also what you saw when people showed up opening day and in the subsequent days? Gender, race, ethnicity, class, who came to see it, who came most often, how was it paid for? It's a multimedia exhibit.
To be fair, I don't think we really knew for certain who the audience for this exhibit would be. We knew from the outset that it was very important that this be a kind of organic process where the community would be involved from phase one. And these discussions that I mentioned that we had about planning the exhibit that started in 2001, we had 25, 30 people sitting around the table giving us advice about how to go about doing this project. People from the community, political activists, people from the corporate sector, representatives from Rutgers, including myself, museum people, Newark Museum, for example. And so we really tried to involve the community and give them a sense of ownership in this exhibit. And I think that was very, very important to get people through the doors. You can't just do an exhibit and say, we're open now, come on in. And people are like, what the hell is this thing? How come I didn't know about this? How come I wasn't asked to participate? I have a story to tell. And so we went out there looking for people with stories to tell, and we enlisted people in the community, not just to tell their story, but to give us pointers about how they thought the planning process should be done. So it was a very inclusive effort from the beginning. Raising funds proved to be very challenging. It always is. We pursued, I should say Linda mostly pursued corporate sponsors, Prudential, JP Morgan Chase, and others, and call it the perfect storm, but the commitments were made on paper, and then in 2007 the recession hit, the real estate market, stock market crashed, and the corporations, for lack of better words, some of them were unable to fulfill their financial obligations, and that was very challenging. You know, what was challenging when we first approached the corporate community was to explain the exhibit and why this exhibit was important and how this exhibit was different from what they thought it might be, just dredging up the ugly memories of Newark. And that was a big challenge. And as I said, there were some foundations, corporate sponsors that were not on board with that. They thought this was too dangerous a topic. I'm a little frustrated, and I think some of my colleagues and friends at the Historical Society are frustrated, and I'll say this, it is somewhat controversial, but that the corporate sector did not come across and fulfill their financial commitments to the exhibit. And since I no longer work at Rutgers, I have to say that I feel the same about Rutgers, that Rutgers entered into an agreement with the New Jersey Historical Society that they would provide not just moral support, but they would help provide, you know, financial support and the like. And Rutgers, of course, was challenged in their budgets, and they too kind of gave us a little moral support. Clem Price certainly was very helpful, but beyond Clem, Rutgers really didn't fulfill its end of the bargain either. And so the Historical Society ultimately was left pretty much on its own to do this exhibit and really put its own resources on the line to do the exhibit. And unfortunately, that has had repercussions for the Historical Society. Right now, the Historical Society is very challenged financially, has a very slim operating budget. In fact, it's running a deficit at the moment, in part because of this exhibit. This exhibit cost almost $750,000 to put together. A lot of money. That's probably the most money that this Historical Society has ever spent on an exhibit. But in order to do this exhibit and to do it right, it demanded that kind of investment. A lot of the multimedia aspect of the exhibit, the oral history listening stations, the video screens, we understood that especially young people these days relate to things that they can see and they can hear, not just to physical objects and flat text. And so decisions were made to do this as a multimedia exhibit, and those significantly raised the costs of doing the exhibit. So my only regret is that we were not able to raise more money to sustain this exhibit, to make sure when you have equipment, you have video screens, and you have CD players with oral histories and buttons to press and the like, it also takes money to maintain those things. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to maintain those to the best standards that I think were possible. And I think that's sort of tragic. I think it's in part kind of the news cycle. Everybody gets excited about an event on an anniversary, 40th anniversary. Everybody was here. I was here that day at the Historical Society, and I was going around the city, and we were inundated by reporters from all over the place, international and national. I remember escorting Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! And opening up my photo archive to her and showing her the exhibit, and then accompanying her up to the 4th Precinct for the commemoration events. I remember a fellow from Le Figaro, the Parisian sort of conservative newspaper. They were here, of all things. And so it was kind of crazy. There were all these reporters roving around. I was at lunch at 27 Mix, and reporters were hanging out there, and it was kind of fun in a way, because they all wanted to do interviews. They were all tracking me down. My cell phone was ringing constantly. They were calling Clem, they were calling Junius Williams, Bob Curvin, all the people, Linda as well, all the people who were involved in this commemoration. And then just like that, they disappeared. Once the commemoration was done, they were gone, never to be seen from again. To their credit, every year, a group called the People's Organization for Progress, led by Larry Hamm, who was also a witness to the events of '67. He calls it a rebellion. Every year, they gather on Springfield Avenue and 17th, at the site where John Smith was arrested. There's a headstone with the names of the victims on it. Every year they gather. Family members of those who died come there to mourn. Other people come there to reflect. It gets smaller and smaller every year. Now, on the 40th anniversary, people showed up. The press was there. Politicians were there. Cory Booker was there, at least at the outset, on the march from the 4th Precinct over to the monument on 17th. There were concerts at NJ Pack. There was a special concert at NJ Pack that night, Thursday night, I believe. And then it was all done. And then people once again, I think, forgot. And this year is the 45th anniversary. And I think a lot of people at this point have forgotten. There was a small article in the New Jersey Star-Ledger that I saw. Detroit, maybe a 2-paragraph article in the online version of the Detroit Free Press, but very little mention of these events. So now it's sort of disappeared again. And maybe it will come back on the 50th anniversary.
What do you think made the 40th anniversary so spectacular?
Well, I think what made the 40th anniversary so significant and so widely covered was that 4 decades out, people were finally coming forward and telling their stories in a way that they hadn't felt comfortable to do so 10 years, 20 years out, 30 years out. 10 years out, there was still a lot of fear in the city. There was still a great sense of distrust and social disruption. I don't know if people were ready to talk 10 years out. I don't know if people were ready to talk 20 years out. I wasn't here at the time. The 30th anniversary, apparently, Rutgers, Newark, had a commemoration, and that was attended by certain activists. People began to speak. They began to speak again about the events, the 30th anniversary. And then I think the impetus for the 40th was that people were worried that if they didn't tell their story then, that their story would never be heard. That people were getting on in years. It had been 40 years. So many individuals, especially activists of that generation, were now in their mid-60s, some of them in their 70s, some of the merchants were in their 80s, some even pushing 90. And so I think there was a sense of urgency. There certainly was on our part, that if we don't get these stories recorded now, then they're going to be lost. But I think there was a sense that 40 years later, people finally felt comfortable in sharing their stories. I laugh because maybe for some National Guardsmen and state troopers, it was a sense that there was sort of a statute of limitations, that there was nothing they did back in '67 that they could now be held accountable for. And I got that feeling in interviewing some National Guardsmen that they really wanted to get some stuff off their chest. You know, they wanted to explain their side of the story. They wanted to say, look, you know, I joined the Guard because I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I had no idea that somebody was going to send me to Newark and somebody was going to give me a gun and live ammunition. I didn't know this. And I was here. I never expected this would happen. And I didn't know who was shooting at me, but I felt somebody was, and I felt I needed to defend myself, and I've seen horrible things, and I may have done horrible things, and I want to talk about it now. I interviewed this fellow, Craig Mirup, who was a former National Guardsman, and it was clear to me that the stories were still, the feelings, the emotions were still raw. 40 years later, he had arrested 2 guys on Springfield Avenue. And he did his job. He turned them over to the state police. And in his recollection, the state policeman took those 2 individuals and beat them severely. And he was there watching this. And he was, 18, 19 years old. So he couldn't do anything. He felt powerless. The thing that stunned me, he told me that he checked himself into the mental hospital a few days later when his tour was done. Because he had seen this, you know? He was, so I felt bad. You know, people always talk about the Guardsmen like, you know, they're a bunch of murderers, they're butchers, they're bad people. I'm like, no, this guy was just a kid. So, I think, 40 years later, I don't think he would have told that story 10 years after. I don't think he would have told that story 20 years after. But 40 years was maybe enough. So he's like, look, before I die and before I go to the grave with this memory, I'm going to say something. Because I want this to be known. It's funny because I didn't get that same feeling from the state police that I interviewed. I still got a sense of sort of closing ranks, that they wanted to carefully control things. The state police do not have a good record when it comes to this event. The state police, there are numerous affidavits showing that the state police broke people's windows. The windows that said Soul Brother on them that survived the first 2 days, the state police came in here. And this is a fact. This is not speculation. And they broke the windows. Whether they were rogue agents of the state police or whether that was sort of a quasi-official policy. So those guys don't really want to talk so much. I found the National Guardsmen did. And, and the other thing is I found a lot of the merchants and the children of the merchants wanted to talk. The merchants often get accused of all kinds of things, of being unfair to their customers, that, those Jewish merchants ripped off their customers. To be totally honest about it, some did. Some did charge ridiculous interest rates for furniture. Some did, add on to the tab at the grocery store. But there were a lot of merchants who didn't. There were a lot of people of good conscience that owned a delicatessen, a fish market, a flower shop, and their businesses were destroyed. And their businesses were their lifeblood. I think sometimes about the movie Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, where the owner of the pizzeria, Sal, says, you know, I built this business with my own hands. And I get a sense of that from some of the merchants, that their lives were devastated by losing their businesses. People say, oh, well, you know, you just collect the insurance money and you move on. And you do. If you're lucky enough to be insured, you do collect your insurance money and you move on, and you build your deli, you build your Irving's Deli out in Florham Park or Whippany. You rebuild. What choice do you have? But you don't come back to where you were burnt out. The memory is just too raw. So I feel sympathy for those individuals as well. And I feel like their side of the story is often neglected. Even in films like Revolution 67, which was shown on the Point of View series. And I understand the reasoning behind it, that it's point of view. You want to show one point of view, and that point of view largely is focused on the activists who are here in Newark. But you know nothing about the merchants in that film. You don't hear about how their lives were upended or disrupted. You see one or two National Guardsmen in the film, but you don't get a clear sense in that presentation of how those guardsmen were affected by what they saw and what they did here. And it's funny because there's another guy doing a film he's raising funds for it right now. I think the film is tentatively titled The Day the World Changed or something. And I was interviewed for part of that. And that film is like the opposite of Revolution 67. Revolution 67 focuses on the political activists. This film focuses on sort of the white community, on the firefighters, the police officers, the merchants, and so on, and tells their side of the story. And it's interesting that you have two films, each telling different sides of the story. This exhibit here, I think, not to be too boastful, tries to cover all sides of the story. So you hear from the merchant that had the delicatessen. You hear from the National Guardsmen. You hear from the African American political activists. You know, you hear from political officials, police officers, everybody. So that's what I like, you know. In some respects, the exhibit, the oral histories and the listening stations and everything it's sort of a cacophony of voices. It's all these people talking about their memories of 67, and I think that I prefer that. I think it's fair. I think it's more fair. I think it's more balanced to let the stories be told and let the people who come to the exhibit figure out how they feel about it. You know, let them do the hard mental work.